For decades, Paul Newman was everything Hollywood wanted to believe in: blue-eyed, kind-hearted, and loyal to the end. But behind the calm smile that conquered millions, there was a man his own family could barely recognize. When his daughter, Nell Newman, finally decided to speak publicly, the truth she revealed tore through the image of perfection that had followed him for half a century. It wasn't a scandal born of gossip. It was the story of a daughter who had spent her life trying to understand the silence of the man the world called a saint. And when she turned 63, she broke that silence once and for all. The legend and the walls of silence. Paul Newman was born on January 26, 1925, in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. To the world, his story began with a smile, the kind that made producers invest millions and women fall in love without ever meeting him. But for his family, that smile was a mask. Behind the camera, he was a man haunted by guilt, secrets, and a kind of loneliness that even fame couldn't cure. His daughter, Nell, grew up in that silence, watching a father who was present in body but often absent in soul. He rarely spoke of his childhood. His father, Arthur, was Jewish and emotionally distant. His mother, Teresa, was loving but controlling. The contradictions followed him forever. Newman carried those wounds into adulthood, through war, through fame, through every role he played. By the time he became a star with The Hustler and Cool Hand Luke, he had already built an invisible wall between himself and the people closest to him. Inside their grand Connecticut home, Nell learned quickly what could and couldn't be said. Her parents, Paul and Joanne Woodward, looked perfect on magazine covers, but at the dinner table words were few and affection was rarer. She remembered how her mother's smile would fade when her father entered the room, and how he would vanish for days, returning with excuses no one dared to question. The world saw one of Hollywood's most beautiful marriages. Nell saw a man terrified of being truly known. Years later, she would call it the silence that built our family. It was the silence that hid his drinking, the guilt over her brother Scott's death, and something else. Something she never fully understood until long after he was gone. The son, who asked the forbidden question. Before Nell ever dared to speak, it was her brother Scott who first shattered the family's silence. He was Paul Newman's eldest son, handsome, talented, and restless, but also the one who saw through the illusions faster than anyone else. Hollywood called him Paul's mirror image, the son destined to carry on the Newman legacy. But to those who knew him best, Scott lived in quiet agony, trapped between admiration and resentment for the father who cast a shadow too large to escape. From the outside, their family looked untouchable. Paul and Joanne were America's royal couple, the picture of devotion. But inside their home in Westport, Connecticut, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Paul's long absences, his secretive phone calls, his struggle with alcohol, they all fed the same rumor that no one dared to name. Joanne's pain was visible to her children, especially to Scott. He was old enough to recognize that his parents' love was something staged, rehearsed, and forced to continue for the cameras. By the mid-1970s, Scott's anger had begun to boil. He had followed his father into acting, but success came with a curse. He was told repeatedly that he wasn't Paul Newman enough. When gossip magazines published a 1950s photo of two men, one of them bearing an uncanny resemblance to Paul, walking hand in hand along a California beach, Scott's humiliation was merciless. "Ask your dad who he really loves," one of his classmates sneered at a party. Scott snapped, breaking the boy's nose. It was the first time the family's secret exploded in public. Paul didn't come to the school. He didn't defend his son. He sent a lawyer with a settlement and a warning to stay quiet. That silence killed more than pride. It killed connection. Within 3 years, Scott was gone. On November 20th, 1978, police found him dead in his Los Angeles apartment. The report called it an overdose. Nell called it something else. He died from silence. Her brother had asked the forbidden question, "Who are you really?" And no one ever answered. That question would haunt Nell for the rest of her life until the day she found the letter that changed everything. The letter that revealed the truth. It was winter in Connecticut, 1981. Nell was 22, home from college, still mourning her brother, still searching for the version of her father that existed only in other people's memories. The world called him kind, generous, humble, the philanthropist with blue eyes and a golden heart. But she had seen the other Paul Newman, the one who locked himself away in his study for hours, who drank in silence, and who carried guilt like a second skin. That night, while walking down the hall to fetch a blanket, she noticed a thin line of light spilling through the door of his study. Curiosity pulled her closer. Inside, her father was hunched over his desk, pen in hand, writing on thick cream-colored paper. It wasn't a script, and it wasn't a business document. Across the top, she read the words, "Dear Red." Her heart froze. She knew that name. Everyone did. Robert Redford, her father's closest friend, his partner in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and the man Hollywood adored for his charm and golden boy looks. They had worked together for years, and the press had always called them inseparable. But what Nell read next was not friendship. It was something far more intimate. In the letter, Paul wrote about the way Redford had once looked at him on set, how that single glance made him feel seen in a way no one else ever had. "You reminded me I was still human," he wrote. "If you ever walked into this room and looked at me the way you once did, I'd give it all up. The fame, the family, the act." Nell's hands trembled. She wasn't supposed to see it. But in that moment, every unspoken question of her childhood began to make sense. The distance, the tension, the quiet pain in her mother's eyes. Joanne Woodward had always been graceful, but beneath that grace was exhaustion. Nell would later recall a night when her mother whispered, "Not every man loves women, darling. Hollywood will never accept that letter to Redford was the proof." Her father had been living a double life, one for the world and another for the man he couldn't publicly love. From that night on, Nell could never look at her parents the same way again. The night her mother found out. Not long after Nell discovered the letter, the secret she had stumbled upon burst into the open. It was early spring, 1981, when Joanne Woodward received a phone call that would end the illusion she had guarded for decades. The voice on the other end was calm, almost polite, but the message was devastating. "If you still care about your marriage, go to the Mayflower Hotel, room 708. Paul had told her he was in New York meeting a director about a new project. Joanne didn't question him, not at first. But something inside her, a quiet instinct sharpened by years of suspicion, pushed her to act. She caught the next flight from Los Angeles to New York and went straight to the hotel. What happened behind that door was never spoken aloud, not even to Nell. But when Joanne returned home to Westport that night, her face told the story. Her eyes were red, her wrist was bruised, and her silence was absolute. From that day forward, the marriage that Hollywood had celebrated as perfect became a performance, one that both of them continued out of habit, duty, and fear of exposure. Paul stopped speaking at dinner. He drank more. Some nights he would sit outside alone for hours, chain-smoking, staring at nothing. Nell once dropped a record in the dining room and watched her father hurl a glass vase against the wall without a word. The anger wasn't directed at her. It was at himself, a man trapped by his own legend. For Joanne, the wound ran deeper. She had known about his affairs before, rumors with actresses, whispers from sets. But this was different. This was love. Redford wasn't just another name in the papers. He was the man Paul wrote to, the man who had seen a side of him she never could. When reporters asked her years later about Redford, She answered only 2 words. That man. Behind those 2 words was a lifetime of humiliation. Joanne had devoted herself to keeping her family together, raising 3 daughters, protecting her husband's image, forgiving what couldn't be forgiven. But after that night, she stopped calling Paul honey. The affection vanished. The cameras still caught their smiles, but at home, they lived as strangers. For Nell, the realization was brutal. Her parents' love, once idolized by millions, had never been real in the way she believed. It was a contract built on silence, and the truth had finally torn it apart. The will that shattered the family. When Paul Newman died on September 26, 2008, the world mourned a legend. The newspapers printed tributes, actors wept on television, and the headlines called him Hollywood's last gentleman. But for his family, grief was quickly replaced by disbelief. Just 3 days after the funeral, Nell received a call from her father's private law office in New York. The voice on the line was cold, formal, and final. The will has been activated. The division of assets is complete. She expected sorrow, but what she found was betrayal. The will, signed only 6 weeks before Paul's death, erased everything her family had been promised. Joanne Woodward, the wife who had shared 50 years of his life and was now struggling with Alzheimer's, was left with nothing. Not a house, not a share of his fortune, not even partial control of his charitable foundation. The Newman children, Nell, Melissa, and Clea, were granted only minimal cash allowances. Everything else, the $600 million estate, his royalties, his image rights, his ownership in Newman's Own, went to a single entity, the Newman's Own Foundation. And at the head of that empire stood one man, Robert Forrester, Paul's longtime business associate. It might have seemed like an act of philanthropy, but to Nell it was something else entirely. "We didn't just lose our father," she later said. "We lost the chance to know who he really was." Then came the real shock. A private clause in the will, leaked months later, referenced a trust titled The Quiet Legacy. The first beneficiary was not Joanne, not the children, but a person identified only by 2 initials, RR. Within days, speculation ignited. Journalists from Vanity Fair and the New York Post claimed that RR referred to Robert Redford. The rumor was impossible to ignore. For decades, the 2 men had been called brothers, soulmates, partners. But now it looked like Paul had left behind not just a legacy, but a confession written in legal ink. Nell remembered the letter she had once read, and suddenly it all made sense. The mysterious meetings, the unspoken tension, her mother's pain, every fragment of her childhood rearranged into a truth she wished she could unsee. And as the lawsuits began, as lawyers fought over the empire Paul had built, the one thing that remained untouched was the silence. The silence that had defined his life, and now, his death. The final confession and the daughter's truth. By the time Nell reached her 60s, the myth of Paul Newman had already been carved in stone. His films were timeless, his charities still thriving, and his name synonymous with goodness. But behind that legend, his family remained fractured, divided not by greed, but by unanswered questions. In 2021, a former assistant uncovered a letter hidden inside The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, one of Paul and Joanne's favorite books. The handwriting was unmistakable. The words were heartbreakingly clear. "My dearest Joanne, if I am no longer lucid enough to say this to you directly, then read it here. Everything belongs to you. The name, the career, the reason I still exist. If anything goes astray, believe that I did not choose it. I love you until the very end. Paul." That letter never appeared in the legal files. It had no power in court, but to Nell, it was her father's final act of repentance. "He wanted to make it right," she said quietly. He just ran out of time. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Joanne, once the graceful center of their world, had slipped deep into Alzheimer's. Some days she didn't even remember who Paul was. Yet even in her confusion, one name still haunted her: Robert. Nurses recalled how she would whisper it late at night, as if arguing with ghosts that refused to leave her alone. She remembered the scent of another person's cologne on her husband's clothes. She remembered the phone calls from the Essex House Hotel. And one night, she murmured through tears, "He never looked at me the way he looked at Robert." For Nell, that was the moment everything connected. The rumors weren't just gossip. They were the missing pieces of a life built on contradictions. Her father had loved deeply, but not always honestly. His generosity had built empires, but his secrets had destroyed intimacy. He had spent a lifetime saving strangers while failing to save the people who needed him most. When Nell finally spoke to CBS Sunday Morning in 2025, she didn't do it to disgrace him. She did it to tell the truth, to humanize the man everyone thought was flawless. "I never stopped loving my father," she said, her voice shaking. "But love without truth is just silence. And silence is what killed us." In the end, that was her confession as much as his. She had protected his image for decades, but at 63, she chose to protect his truth instead. Because even the greatest legends are still human, and even the strongest families can crumble under the weight of secrets. Paul Newman's blue eyes once made the world fall in love. But behind them was a story no one was ever meant to hear. Now that his daughter has spoken, do you believe he was a good man who made mistakes, or a legend who hid too much for too long? Tell us your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories.